Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. So, this class actually is a continuation of the previous class where Rao-san and Hana-san are talking, and Rao-san wants to know about the greetings and about the expressions that are used in the language. Now, he learns a lot of expressions in the previous conversation that you heard. So, let us see what all new we have and what all Rao-san gets to learn from Hana-san. So, just listen to the kaiwa and see if you can catch some of the old phrases. Rao-san wa sensei no otaku ni itta toki no hanashi o shite imasu.
すみませんけど、ごちそうさまってどういう意味ですか？そして朝と昼間はおはようございますとこんにちはという挨拶を使いますけど、晩と夜はどんな挨拶を使いますか？
両方はこんばんはです。そして人と別れるとき、失礼しますを使います。
そうですか。じゃあさよならはいつ使いますか？
ラオさん、日本人は人と別れるとき、さよならも使うし、元気でねも使います。でも私は失礼しますの方がいいと思います。
どうもありがとうございました。
So you just heard the kaiwa. Whatever you have not understood, we are going to learn over here now. So Rao-san wa sensei no otaku ni itta toki no hanashi o shite imasu. Rao-san wa sensei no otaku ni itta toki no hanashi o Hana-san ni shite imasu. すみませんけど、ごちそうさまってどういう意味ですか？ Now this te over here, I have written it like this specially, though when you write it in Japanese, it's going to be together. And te means what about this word? What is the meaning of this word? ごちそうさまって。So, the meaning that you want to know, you just put it in inverted commas, and like this you can ask gochiso samatte, double sound te, meaning what is the meaning of this word. In Japanese, it is going to be written in the script like this, gochiso samatte. Do you imi, you have done this one, do you imi, what is it called? Imi is meaning, and you, what is the meaning of this word, this ka? For example, if you want to say ikimasu or ichigo, ikimasu te douyu imi, ichigo te douyu mono? What is ichigo? In a very, very colloquial way, informal way. Of course, you know informal manner is never used with seniors. そして朝と昼間はおはようございますとこんにちはという挨拶を使うけど、そして and as it's joining two sentences, 朝と昼間、朝 you know is morning, 昼間 is afternoon, during the day. So, おはようございますとこんにちは。Good morning and good day. という挨拶 which is called greeting, こんにちは and おはようございます is used. But 晩と夜は晩 is evening and 夜 is night. はどんな挨拶を使いますか？ So どんな over here, I will just explain. 挨拶 is greeting を使いますか？ What do you use? Now どんな you have done this series こそあど series, if you remember, これそれあれ and どれ then kono, sono, sono, ano and dono. Then you have also done koko, soko, asoko and doko over here like this and then like this. Now, another informal series which says which type of, which is konna, sonna, anna and donna. Donna is the question word. So, now you can read Banto yoru wa donna, what kind of, what type of aisatsu o tsukaimasu ka? Use. Verb in dictionary form is tsukau. Ryoho wa konbanwa desu. Ryoho is both. Soshite hito to wakareru toki shitsurei shimasu o tsukaimasu. Soshite hito to wakareru toki. So, at the time of leaving, when you are separating after a meeting, after having met the person, shitsurei shimasu o tsukaimasu. That excuse me please. So desu ka? Is that so? Ja, sayonara wa itsu tsukaimasu ka? Another question word meaning when. Nihonjin wa hito to wakareru toki, when they separate from each other after a meeting, sayonara mo tsukau shi, genki de ne mo tsukaimasu. So, you have done this pattern A mo, B mo, I do this also and I do this also. So, same pattern you can see over here, A mo and B mo tsukaimasu. Now, the new word over here is she, which we are going to do after a while. Demo watashi wa shitsurei shimasu no hou ga ii to omoimasu. So, you have your revision over here with to omoimasu and no hou ga, which means I think it is better to use shitsurei shimasu. This is my personal opinion. So, now this kaiwa is, I am sure, clear, and there are a few things which we will do in detail now. So, over here there are certain kanjis which you may even leave, they are a little difficult, are not even in your course. So, you have asa which you can do, then you, I have done it once with you, then ryoho. Ryoho is very simple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and ho is like this, ryoho. Wakaru, wakareru and wakaru both are same, one is to understand and one is to divide or separate. So, you can do this kanji as well. Now, there was a word in your last lesson which I wanted to do, but could not because there was very little time, and that was nanika. Now, what is nanika? Nanika, as you know, is an interrogative word, and how do you make it? By joining nani plus ka. Now, you have to understand that this ka over here is not a question particle at all, and always nanika is written in hiragana. Nanika o nomimashou ka? Shall we have something? Shall we have something? So, the meaning is something, as you can see over here. Now, with nanika, the person knows that he wants to have something, but he is unable to decide. So, nanika nomimashou ka? And if you say nani o nomimasu ka, what does it mean? What will you have? So it's a direct question. Nani o nomimasu ka? What will you have? I don't know what you want to have. Over here, nani ka nomimashou ka? So over here we know that the person wants to have something. So what shall I have? This question direct, this question the speaker does not even know what he wants to have. Nani o mimasu ka? Eiga o mimasu or Nihon no eiga o mimasu. Nani ka mimashou ka? The answer could be hai, nani ka mimashou. Let's see something, watch something. To put emphasis on what you are saying, you may also use particle o, but it is not essential. Another thing which is important is that in Japanese, when you are talking, sometimes particles are just not used, but when writing, particles are important. Now you can see from the example, Kohi ga daisuki desu. Anata wa nani o nomimasu ka? So maybe there is choice also. He is just inquiring, what will you have? Kohi o nomimasu. Over here as we have coffee, so kohi o nomimasu. He could also say biru o nomimasu or juice o nomimasu or juice o nomimashou. So he decides for everybody and says mashou, kohi o or biru o nomimashou. Now the question could be nani ka nomimasu ka? A very direct question. Will you have something? So see a situation, if someone comes to your house, what do you generally ask? What will you have? And not will you have something? Something will sound very, very rude, whereas when you say what will you have, it sounds very polite in this situation. So please remember what to use where. Now this gentleman has taken a lot of beer, he is enjoying himself, or maybe he is asking his friend, what do you want to have? So nani ka nomimashou ka? Shall we have something? Biru o nomimashou, as I just told you in your previous slide. Nani ka nomimashou ka? Hai, biru o nomimashou. But if this is the question, what is the answer? So it is nani o nomimasu ka? 1. So biru o nomitai desu, if this is the answer. Or he could ask, nani ka nomitai desu ka? Hai, biru o nomitai. So you know how to use and where to use nani ka and nani. There is lots more for you. So nani ka tabetai desu, I want to eat something. Nani o tabemasu ka? What will you have? See, sandwich wa dou? What about sandwich? Sandwich. So kesa, today morning, tabeta kara, I have already had. The action is over. Ramen o tabemashou ka? Shall we have ramen? Ramen daisuki desu kara tabemashou. I love ramen, so please let's have ramen. Or he could just say so shimashou. Instead of saying this, he could say this also, just this much, because already ramen o tabemashou ka? Shall we have ramen? So answer is yes, let's do as you are saying. Now how to use koto, which you have done in your previous lessons with nani ka. Nani ka omoshiroi koto o kikimashita ka? Nani ka something omoshiroi, interesting, something interesting o kikimashita ka? So with adjectives. Omoshiroi koto, something interesting. そこに何かありますか? そこに over there. Something ありますか is something over there, is something over there, like this. 他に何かいりますか? 他に is other. 何か is something, as you know already. いります is from the verb いる, which means required, needed. Do you need anything else? Is anything else required? So, いります. いる. So, you remove the u part and put います plus います is equal to いります. いる is also to be, which is います. Two different verbs. Please remember, 他に何かいりますか? Do you need anything else? So, this is how you will use nanika in various situations. Try to do that with your partner. Now, you just heard the kaiwa, and in our last class we studied verb in plain past form plus ato, and you know toki is a noun. So, how will you use toki with verb in past form? So, verb ta plus toki. For example, hana shita toki, atta toki, or matte ita toki. So, matteta toki when you are talking. Matteta toki. How is this coming from? Matte imasu. Plain form is matte iru. Matte ita, past form, and from there matteta toki, because we need it in past form. Now, let us see the examples. Gakko ni ita toki, yoku sports o shimashita. So, when I was in school, when. So, you will see over here that as the verb is in past form, the action has already been completed. You are talking of a time which is in the past. Gakko ni ita toki, when I was in school. Yoku sports o shimashita, I did a lot of sports. I played a lot. Now, you can also use particle ni after toki. And what does particle ni do over here? Well, you know that ni is used with time, specific time. So, this is a specific time in your life. So, gakko ni ita toki ni makes it even more specific, and you want to put emphasis on this period. So, gakko ni ita toki ni yoku sports o shimashita. No other toki, no other time, this time. Nihon ni ita toki, so when I was in Japan. Nihon no bunka, Japanese culture o benkyou shimashita at that time. So, already the benkyou is over. You have done the benkyou, completed the benkyou. Tomodachi ni atta toki ni. See this ni over here, aisatsu o shimashita. When I met my friends, I did aisatsu. Tanaka-san no tomodachi ni atta toki ni chanto aisatsu o shimashita. I did my aisatsu properly. Tomodachi to wakareru toki, when you are separating, when you are leaving, you are going your different ways. What do you do? Shitsurei shimasu to iimashita. So, because it is wakareta toki, so a specific time I did this. Otherwise, you can also say imasu. That is, when you leave your friends, then you should say shitsure shimasu. Wakareru, wakareru is to divide like this, to separate, to divide. This is with verbs, you can see, in past form. Now, if the verb is in plain present form, that is in the dictionary form, then what does it show? It shows that the action has not been completed. It is for the future basically. So, now you can see over here how it is done. So, verb in dictionary form, which is ru and u for group 1 and group 2 plus toki. What happens now? Tomodachi, or you could say hito ni au toki aisatsu wo shimasu. So, what do you do when you meet people? You generally greet them. So, tomodachi ni au toki aisatsu wo shimasu, or hito ni au toki aisatsu wo shimasu. When you meet people, then you do your greetings. Au is aimasu, to meet. So, au toki, when you meet them, and particle ni over here is specific for au. So, please remember that particle ni will be used before verb aimasu. Tomodachi ni au toki aisatsu o shimasu. Wakareru toki aisatsu o shimasu. Minna wakareru toki aisatsu o shimasu. All people, when they leave, then they do their aisatsus. Ototo wa ban gohan o taberu toki. When my brother eats his gohan. Itsumo terebi o mimasu. Itsumo is always. Terebi o mimasu. Watashi no heya ni hairu toki noku gurai shite kudasai. So, you have done gurai, and we have seen that it has a negative meaning. Over here it is shite kudasai. So, if you look at the sentence, it will show very clearly that your brother or maybe anyone, your friend is not very happy that you enter the room without knocking or without announcing or calling out the name of the person who is in the room. So, the person is angry and could say, please knock, noku gurai o shite ne, or a general statement, watashi no heya ni hairu toki, please, when you enter my room, noku gurai, this much at least you can do. Noku gurai shite kudasai, please at least knock. And then come, and shite kudasai is actually an order, a polite request, but a direct request to the listener, where his opinion is not taken into consideration. Now, as toki is a time expression, you have to also remember one thing, that it cannot be used with another time expression. It means that if a sentence has toki, then you cannot use another time expression like ban or kesa or asa in the sentence with toki. So, let us see how that is done. Ban no toki ikimasu. This is incorrect. Why? Because toki is also here, which is time expression, and again you have ban, which is also a time expression. So, what is the correct way to say it? Ban ni ikimasu, because it is time, a specific time, evening. So, ni can be used. Ban ni ikimasu. Then you have ashita, which is again a time expression, no toki, time expression over here, time expression over here. So, you cannot use this, it is incorrect. And what is correct again? Ashita shimasu. ashita ikimasu. Please remember, cannot use two time expressions together, thinking that if you just add no it is okay. No, it is incorrect. Now also you see, this is how Japanese will be written. There are no spaces provided, though I try to put the space as we are all used to looking at spaces between words in Hindi or in English. But in Japanese you have to get used to this pattern of writing. Now there is another thing. If the subject of toki is different from the main clause, then the second subject will take particle ga. Now this is always a problem, when to use ga and when to use wa. So all this about toki and clause and predicate and subject makes it very, very difficult when you are talking during conversation. So the best thing to do is, if there are two subjects, that is one primary and one secondary, then the first one will take wa and the second one will take ga. Ototo wa watashi ga koukosei datta toki. So we are talking of ototo and also of watashi. So now see over here, ototo wa watashi ga koukosei datta toki. Where was he? So basically it is ototo that I am talking about. Ototo wa shogakko 1 nensei datta at some time. So I am over here, thus ga and koukosei datta toki. When I was koukosei, then ototo wa shogakko 1 nensei datta. He was in shogakko 1 nen. Mira wa watashi ga Nihon ni itta toki. So Mira wa. Now watashi ga Nihon ni itta toki, when I was in Japan, where was she? She was in America. America ni imashita. So again you have ga over here. Then imoto wa watashi ga kaisha ni haitta toki, mada 10 sai datta. So imoto wa again over here. Now watashi ga kaisha ni haitta toki, imoto wa mada 11 sai or 10 sai datta. Mada, still. This part you know. So what are you emphasizing? Watashi ga kaisha ni haitta toki, imoto wa mada 10 sai datta. With ga you put more emphasis. There is another time expression which is jikan. So as toki and jikan are a little confusing as they mean the same, which is time. So let us see how the two are going to be used. So toki we know is time and jikan is time span. As you can see, it is written over here, time period, time span, time taken to do a certain activity, whereas toki is that exact time, when. So how is it going to be used? In plain form, dictionary form and past plain form. With noun no toki or datta toki, and with adjectives yasui toki or yasukatta toki in past tense. You can see past is over here, so always past plain is there, plus toki. We just now did gakko ni ita toki. Ita toki. So now let us see. 2 jikan benkyou shimashita. Gakko ni ita toki is what? When I was in school, I did something, whatever I did, but when I was in school. Now, watashi wa mainichi 2 jikan benkyou shimasu or shimashita. So 2 jikan for a period of 2 hours. So kan is associated with hours. Now you can make one sentence out of it. Gakko ni ita toki watashi wa mainichi 2 jikan benkyou shimashita. When I was in school, I studied every day for 2 hours. Donna toki benkyou shimasu ka? We just now did donna, what time? What time benkyou shimasu ka? Donna toki. You are playing all the time. I don't see you studying at all. So, donna toki benkyou shimasu ka? What time do you study? So, this is how you will use donna, jikan in past and toki. You can join the two and make better sentences. Now, see from the examples. Chichi wa asa gohan o taberu toki shimbun o yomimasu. So, this is a statement. Action has not happened as yet. This is just a statement where he says that he does this every day. Chichi wa asa gohan o taberu toki, when he eats gohan, shimbun o yomimasu. It is not a one-time activity. This is just a statement. Sensei to hanasu toki keigo o tsukatte kudasai. Please use keigo, which is polite form, when you are talking to your teacher. Benkyou suru toki, when you are studying, ongaku o kikanai de ne. So, I am sure this you have heard from your mother or from your elder brothers and sisters, that when you are studying, please do not listen to music. Ongaku is music. Kikanai de. Now, kudasai is not used. So, obviously, this is from someone who is older to you. This is more direct. Now, you have seen how to use toki with verbs in our previous slide. Toki can also be used with nouns and the meaning does not change, which is when. So, let us try to understand from the examples as to how toki is going to be used with nouns. Benkyou no toki. So, just the noun and you have to add no over here. Benkyou no toki den wa shinai de ne. Please do not call me when I am studying. I has been added over here, or just a statement. When studying, please do not call. Shuppatsu no toki. This is something that I am sure we as Indians have heard a lot from people older to us. Our grandmothers and grandfathers who would say, please do not say anything when someone is leaving. So, shuppatsu no toki. Shuppatsu no toki, koe o kakenai de kudasai. Shuppatsu is departure. No toki, at the time of departure. Koe is do not call out, do not say something when someone is leaving, a simple statement. And sensei datta toki, when I was a teacher. Ironna kuni no ryugakusei ni aimashita. Ryugakusei is foreign students. So, ironna kuni no, from different countries, foreign students ni aimashita. Or sensei datta toki ironna kuni no gakusei ni aimashita. Aimasu will take particle ni. Musume ni kono tokei o sotsugyo no toki ni agemasu. Musume ni. Now, ni is 2 over here because we have agemasu. So, the pattern is watashi wa someone ni agemasu. I give someone. So, watashi wa someone ni ageru. Musume ni kono tokei o sotsugyo no toki. This is a specific time ni agemasu. Now, a very simple kanji which is also ue and used for ageru. So, 1, 2 and 3. Then we also have another kanji over here which is very, very simple, which is aimasu. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. 1, 2, au. Then there is another kanji which is again very simple. You have done doyobi like this, but see the difference over here is this is small, you can see. Then we have So, koe, which is voice, sound. Now, Mira wa kudamono ga yasui toki ni kaimasu. Ni is for emphasis. You can remove the ni as well. So, Mira wa kudamono is fruits, ga yasui toki, adjective. So, simple adjective plus toki. You can use toki also, put ni also, putting more emphasis. Toki ni kaimasu. Another simple kanji, you see this is an inverted me, which is I, then you have me over here and the feet of the person. So, of course, this is a little disproportionate. So, like this and this, kau. Once again, kau. So, you can remember these 3 characters. They are simple and easy to memorize. As these kanjis you keep repeating all the time, these words you keep repeating all the time. Now, there was another word in the conversation which was she. Now, she is a conjunction which is a joining word and it can be used with verbs, adjectives and nouns. And what does it mean? It is equivalent to and for adjectives, verbs and nouns. Like you did to for just nouns and you did kute for adjectives. So, now she for verbs and nouns and adjectives later. What is the pattern? Pattern is simple: verb in dictionary form past and present, noun and na adjectives plus da plus she, and then adjectives as is plus she. So, let us see. Kyou wa tenki mo ii shi, yasumi da shi, doko ka e ikimashou ka or ikou ka. So, I will just tell you, kyou wa tenki mo ii shi. So, A mo, B mo first and foremost. E is good, she is and, tenki is very good and it is also a holiday. So, yasumi desu instead of this because verb is coming in the sentence like this. So, plain form is da. As you can see over here also, kyou wa tenki mo ii shi. Tenki is also good, it is also a yasumi. Over here she is also. Doko ka e ikimashou. So, this word, question word, we are going to do in detail in our next lesson. For the time being, it means somewhere. E ikimashou. So, more colloquial, more informal for ikimashou is iko. We are going to do this also with other verbs in our next lesson. You can see she being used over here. Kanojo wa ii toki mo warui toki mo. Good times also, bad times also. Waraimasu. She is always laughing. Kanojo wa ii toki mo atta shi. Now with verb atta shi, warui toki mo arimashita. Also arimashita. So, she had good times and she also had bad times. Kanojo is she and kare is he. Kanojo wa kibun ga ii toki mo warau shi, warui toki mo waraimasu. Kibun is feeling. So, kanojo wa kibun ga ii toki. She is happy when she feels good and she also smiles when she is not feeling that good. Warui toki. Warui is actually bad, but over here it is with feeling. Warui toki means not feeling very good, feeling a little low or down. So, warui toki mo waraimasu. So, you can use she with nouns, with adjectives and with verbs you saw just now. Practice in a similar manner and then make a small kaiwa and you will be able to do it well. Don't have to worry at all. It's very, very simple. Just follow this pattern. Now, today I also have some kanji for you. You did this word hiru over here like this, nichi and here. So, it is a 9-stroke character, meaning hiru means noon. Once again, and this. Now, you have hiru gohan. So, concentrate on this part. Gohan we will do some other time. Gohan means food also, and gohan also means cooked rice. So, hiru gohan together means lunch. Hiru gohan. Again you can see, count and see 9 strokes. Now, hiruma. This you did with Aida also and Jikan also. 2 readings for this. I did it last time as well, and again over here kan. So, hiru ma, that is another reading for it. You did it in Jikan also, kono Aida also, and today as ma. So, the stroke order is a little incorrect over here. Please get the correct stroke order which I had made in the beginning, and then you have this and this, hiru and ma. Now, you have asa. You make a plus sign, make nichi and make plus again, and then getsu. So, asa. And kesa also has the same kanji character. This you have done earlier, means ima, and today kyo, then asa over here. Kyo no asa is kesa. Now, there is some more. I just now did this with you, kan, and you have also done it with ji, which is time. So, ji and kan, like this, making ji kan, ji and kan. Time period, time span. This is just Aida in between. A san to B san no Aida ni Tanaka san ga imasu. So, nagai Aida, Aida. So, you have Aida over here, you have kan reading over here, and hiruma another reading for the same character. Nagai Aida. Nagai, this character is nagai. I will do it with other adjectives soon. Now, this is all vocabulary for you. Go over the vocabulary. There is lot of new vocabulary today, especially hokani, which means other or else. Then bunka is culture. So, you can make some sentences and see how much you can remember and use. And with this, I would like to end the class today. I think you have done a lot of things, learnt some new expressions, how to use toki, how to use she, the short te form, which is you did in the word gochiso sama te nan desu ka? What is the meaning of the word gochiso sama? So, please practice all these things and see if you can make your Japanese better and converse very easily with friends. With this, I will end over here and come prepared for your next class. The next class is also a continuation of the same kaiwa, and there are a lot of other expressions that you are going to learn. So, minasan arigatou gozaimashita. Mata aimashou.